Hi. So this is the second and last week of the two-week meeting of the states to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're meeting in New York for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee. This is a third preparatory committee towards the 2020 review conference of the NPT, which is the big conference that is held every 5 years. And each of these is preceded by three preparatory committees held in New York, Geneva, and Vienna. And the mood was quite interesting, and I think top of mind for a lot of people is actually the fate of next year's review conference, the fate of the conference. This is the last preparatory committee before it, and I think the fault lines in the architecture of the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime are growing deeper, more profound. There's evidence of very strong divisions, of very divergent views as to what might be the best approach to proceed toward nuclear disarmament, and I think these divisions are going to be felt quite profoundly next year in New York. For a bit of context, I mean the expectation these days, or at least the measure of success for review conferences that are held every 5 years, has been the fact that the states parties are able to agree on a consensus outcome document. And this is not a high bar, mind you. This is, in fact, it tends to be sort of lowest common denominator language in these outcome documents. But at least the presence of such a document tends to be evidence that states are able to find some common ground with regard to the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. However, we come from the 2015 NPT review conference without an outcome document. Back then, the international community was not able to agree on an outcome document. We thought we had there was the makings of an outcome document, and there was a draft that was generally agreed upon, and almost at the last minute, three states, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, blocked consensus on that outcome document, and it was clear that such a move was as a result of concerns that had been expressed by Israel, who is a non-state party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, concerns that were in turn related to the specific references made in that document to the need to hold a conference on the Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, and Israel had concerns about the wording, and through Canada, the UK, and the US, they blocked that document. So that is the context. We come from a situation where it was a failure, so to speak, the last review conference, and next year's, it's anybody's guess whether the international community might be able to agree on a consensus document, and I would not hold my breath if I were a betting person. I would not be sure that we will be seeing an outcome document next year. So some impressions from last week in New York, where I attended some of the proceedings of this NPT Preparatory Committee. First of all, of course, the divisions in terms of the states parties, and there might be a widespread, to some extent, misconception out there that there are generally two groups in terms of states parties to the NPT or United Nations membership. That there are the few that have nuclear weapons and are reluctant, they remain reluctant to give them up, and the vast majority of the international community that are all pulling in the same direction towards nuclear abolition. In reality, it's a bit more nuanced than that, and critically, there is a third group of non-nuclear weapon states that one would hope would be aligned with those pulling for nuclear abolition and demanding concrete progress on nuclear disarmament. But there is a third group of non-nuclear weapon states whose policies are actually more closely aligned with those of states that have nuclear weapons. These are states that are members of nuclear alliances, such as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or have otherwise individual nuclear security arrangements with states that possess nuclear weapons. Now, these states are critical and are seen to be critical to sort of break the deadlock and actually help generate the conditions that will lead to disarmament, but they have been in their policies and their doctrine and their public statements unwilling to categorically reject nuclear weapons. They still lend cover to states with nuclear weapons. They still say that such weapons are necessary for their protection. They still give value to the concept of extended nuclear deterrence and nuclear umbrellas. And even though these are contexts that have been widely and repeatedly challenged, not only from a political perspective, but also from a political utility perspective. Even so, that's the position of these states, including Canada, including all members of NATO, that again continue to side with states that have nuclear weapons. A recurring point made by these states, both nuclear-dependent states such as NATO members and the states that actually have the nuclear weapons, is that concrete progress towards disarmament, towards abolition, is premature. But this line of argument has lost a lot of credibility. How can it be premature when it has been more than 73 years since the destruction and the obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only instances in which nuclear weapons were used in conflict? How can it be premature when it's almost 50 years since the entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Indeed, the 2020 review conference next year will coincide with the 50th anniversary of the entry into force of the NPT, which happened in 1970. And 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, still one hears this argument that it is premature. And of course, the flip question is, when would it not be premature? And we have not heard a compelling or a persuasive argument from nuclear-dependent states or from nuclear-possessing states. And they also point to the lack of ideal international security conditions for nuclear disarmament. But this is an impossibly tall order in our view. First of all, the rest of the international community that is committed to non-proliferation, that is to say, to not acquire nuclear weapons, have never made their non-proliferation commitments contingent upon the emergence of ideal international security conditions. They simply comply with that obligation because they take the obligation seriously under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and because they recognize that international security conditions fluctuate as they have and as they predictably will continue to fluctuate. States with nuclear weapons, on the other hand, and their nuclear-dependent allies, they keep referring to the lack of ideal international security conditions, and they claim that the environment right now is not ripe for nuclear abolition. But this is increasingly seen to be a delayed tactic on their part. We've been at the height of the Cold War and all the way down, if you will. And now some people are speaking of a Cold War 2.0. We've seen international crises of varying gravity in different parts of the globe. And I think it's any reasonable observer could foresee that conflicts and points of tension and points of potential crisis will flare up with some regularity in different parts of the world. And that the states with nuclear weapons will in one way or another have a stake in one or more of these potential sources of conflict. But the takeaway here is that nuclear disarmament efforts must commence, be implemented and finalized under international security conditions that are going to be predictably less than perfect. So this sets the stage. These arguments that we have heard from nuclear-dependent states and their nuclear-armed allies versus the arguments, the very compelling and strong arguments by those that are demanding concrete progress to abolition, I think are going to be front and center, those divisions next year at the review conference. And we have seen this week and last week in New York as well, these disagreements flare up. In the middle of it is the very significant, still relatively recent development, which is the historic adoption of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This was a very welcome policy instrument. if you will, by the international community that was impatient, fed up, frustrated because of years of inaction on the nuclear disarmament front, and in some instances not just inaction, but in fact actions that are in the opposite direction of nuclear disarmament, that actually are making us walk farther away from the prospect of nuclear abolition. And these states, in partnership, in very close partnership with several civil society organizations around the globe, including, of course, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons and several others, have found a catalyst and a rallying point around this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which recognizes both the painstakingly slow pace of progress on nuclear abolition on the part of nuclear weapon states, but also the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any nuclear weapons use. States with nuclear weapons still consider the nuclear weapons ban treaty something to reject, to dismiss, to ignore, but in fact it is a reality in the nuclear disarmament realm, for as much as they try to dismiss or minimize it. And they claim that it is a divisive agreement, that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is divisive, when in fact it simply sheds light on long-standing divisions between nuclear weapons haves and nuclear weapons have-nots, and it tries to bridge those divisions by creating in simply one category, states without nuclear weapons. So I think disagreements around the nuclear ban treaty will continue to be front and center, including at next year's review conference. But there are other issues as well that may derail the international community and may make that consensus document elusive in the end. One of them is, I mentioned earlier, is the pursuit of a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East. I should say WMD, weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, including nuclear weapons, which has been a long-standing commitment of the international community, in fact since 1995. This is an issue that is of great importance to some states, especially in the region, but beyond the region as well. And the international community has simply not delivered on related efforts. There was to be a meeting held in 2012, or no later than 2012, already 7 years ago, to get a process kick-started, which never happened. And there is the possibility that this issue alone may, at least for some states parties, delay progress on the NPT review conference itself. And then finally, we see a troubling international sort of strategic environment, and many analysts and observers are witnessing or have commented on rightly so, on the breakdown or evidence of a breakdown in international arms control, including as it relates to the two main nuclear powers, Russia and the United States. Fresh in people's minds is the impact of the Trump administration on nuclear disarmament efforts, and I would highlight three specific areas in which that merit some scrutiny and some analysis in terms of the Trump administration since it came to power. And they are all from 2018. Three separate announcements, all related to nuclear disarmament. First, early in the year, it was the announcement of the release of the NPR, the United States Nuclear Posture Review, the first and only thus far under the Trump administration. And this is widely seen to be, one of the key blueprints of the United States nuclear policy and how they understand the role of nuclear weapons, etc. And this was a very troubling document. And for one thing, it explicitly expanded the role of nuclear weapons in United States policy. It expanded the number of scenarios under which nuclear weapons could be utilized, including as a response to non-nuclear threats such as cyber. So that alone is very troubling. It makes no mention whatsoever of the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. It specifically says that the United States intends not to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So just a list of what not to do to pursue nuclear disarmament. Really, a document that is very troubling, and coming from the United States, of course, it permeates the tone and around the whole regime. As well, in terms of the Trump administration's impact, last year the United States announced that it was going to withdraw from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. And this was a decision that was widely criticized by experts, technical and policy experts alike, and for the main reason that the United States could not point to a single instance of non-compliance by Iran with the terms of the deal. And when the Trump administration announced their withdrawal, an announcement made by President Trump himself, indeed there was no indication of a single instance of non-compliance by Iran with the deal, which, when it was negotiated, despite in a very difficult political environment, despite strong, stringent opposition from some very recalcitrant sectors, it was widely acknowledged to have been a solid deal, all things considered, under the circumstances, including considering what the alternative might have been. And it is not alarmist or an overstatement to say that the alternative could have included military confrontation. Now, only this week, we're seeing some of the perhaps predictable consequences of that decision of the Trump administration, which is, by the way, also in contravention of a Security Council resolution. That Iran has said that it is considering stopping complying with some of the terms of the agreement, because the remaining parties have not provided assurances that it will be shielded, that it will be able to conduct legitimate commerce without fear of reprisal from American sanctions. So this is still unfolding, but it's still a pity and a shame that a solid instrument that was an instance of a diplomatic avenue actually yielding positive effects and resulting in the JCPOA is sort of crumbling before our eyes because of the wrong-headed decision of the Trump administration to withdraw. And finally, the Trump administration as well announced its intention to withdraw from the INF Treaty, which is from 1987, I believe, which has rattled, the disarmament community between the United States and Russia, and in the broader context of the fact that there are no efforts to renew the New START Treaty as well between the United States and Russia. There is a well-warranted preoccupation that we may soon be left with no major international arms control agreement, strategic arms control agreement, of course, involving nuclear forces between the two major powers. And that's just the Trump administration. Of course, the Russia has also a special responsibility to disarm, and it also holds a vast nuclear arsenal. And in fact, every other possessor of nuclear weapons has been investing heavily in their modernization, of their nuclear arsenals, which in turn will increase the shelf life of their nuclear warheads and push evolution even further down the road. So that is the environment. It's not a promising environment. I mean, the good news, if you will, is that there are a lot of highly committed, within and without states. I mean, in civil society, in progressive states, in multilateral organizations, etc. There is a very clear, sophisticated, coordinated, elegant, if you will, pushback to many of the flawed, faulty arguments that we're hearing from nuclear weapon states and their allies, to some of the misleading rationalizations that are given and justifications that are given for the perpetuation of nuclear weapons possession. And at every level, we are seeing this pushback, this positive pushback, politically a very astute intelligent advocacy at key forums and beyond. So this is really, at the end of the day, we're in the midst of a high-stakes humanitarian and political struggle for the abolition of nuclear weapons, which is known to be an existential threat. So the meeting next year will be a key test of the health of the NPT regime, which is in our assessment at Project Ploughshares quite fragile at the moment. But nonetheless, we will not and cannot and shall not despair, and we will continue pushing for concrete progress, both within the NPT and by virtue of complementary instruments, including the treaty, the valuable treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and in every other front where nuclear security can be achieved, where the normative regime can be strengthened, and where actual change can come about from these interactions.